I want to salute Clarence Thomas and Sam Alito, who did want to hear the case. I want you also to keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to keep in mind that the two Trump appointees did not vote. Excuse me, the three Trump appointees did not vote with Thomas and Alito. The three Trump appointees obviously voted with the leftists and John Roberts. 7-2. That would be Barrett, Kavanaugh, and Gorsuch. All three. Really quite disgusting if you think about it. And here's what the Supreme Court did. The state of Texas motion for leave to file a bill of complaint is denied for lack of standing under Article 3 of the Constitution. Now, let me just say this. How can there be a lack of standing when if there's a conflict between the states, the only way that conflict can be heard is original jurisdiction by the United States Supreme Court? To me, that is a misuse of the word standing. It's like the word latches that was used by the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania to get around dealing with a constitutional dispute. Texas has not demonstrated a judicially cognizable interest in the manner in which another state conducts its elections. All other pending motions are dismissed as moot. Statement of Justice Alito, with whom Justice Thomas joins, quote, in my view, we do not have discretion to deny the filing of a bill of complaint in a case that falls within our original jurisdiction, which is the point I just said. And they said, I would therefore grant the motion to file the bill of complaint, but would not grant other relief, and I express no view on any other issue. So they would have taken up the case, but they probably would have taken up the case for the purpose of killing it, I should mention. Let me tell you the irony here. The irony is this. Because the state of Georgia has two races for two Senate seats taking place as I speak, and because the voting process that was in place during the presidential election is still in place, and because the Secretary of State entered into a consent decree with Stacey Abrams that weakened the signature requirement, among other things, that process is still there. Texas was challenging that, among other things. So if, because of that process, the two Democrats win, and they are as radical as they get, they are right there, hardcore left wing, then what happens? 50-50 in the Senate, and Kamala Harris, should she be vice president, is the tie-breaking vote because she's president of the Senate as vice president. What did Chuck Schumer say if they control the Senate and have the presidency in the House? He said he's going to pack the Supreme Court. It's very possible the Supreme Court collectively just slit its own throat. But don't worry, they will have done so with great self-respect and self-aggrandizement. In the end, depending on how the election turns out, the Supreme Court as a group may have just slit its own throat as they duck one case after another. You still have that Article 2 case sitting there where Alito said, as I point out to you, to segregate the petitions, the ballots. It's not enough to do anything. So I guess the court's still fiddling, still fighting over it, still not sure what to do. Can't cobble enough justices to go in one direction or another. I would encourage you not to listen to the usual buffoons and naysayers, the phony legal analysts and all the rest. They know nothing more than you do. They're predictable. They're very predictable. We have these activist courts in the states like we do in Pennsylvania. And they can do pretty much whatever they want to do. And the Supreme Court basically, by inaction, has sanctified these activities. So the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania feels emboldened. The lawless elements in the states feel emboldened. And as of today, Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 of the Constitution, which says that the legislatures shall determine how electors are appointed, doesn't exist anymore. What this court needs is serious leadership, like a William Rehnquist. But instead, it has a little boy who's very concerned about how Linda Greenhouse and others think of him and write about him. But what's troubling to me is the 3 Trump appointees fell right in line. That includes Barrett and Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. Those of you who fight like hell for these justices, fight like hell. You're always disappointed, aren't you? The Democrats know where their justices are going, whether it's on the state Supreme Court or the United States Supreme Court. They all know. We're not asking the justices to be result-oriented. We're actually asking them to take up these cases. They refuse to take up the Pennsylvania case. They refuse to take up the Texas case. They won't even take them to look at them. And in the case of Pennsylvania, they didn't even provide an explanation. You have every reason to be furious. You look at the various aspects of this republic and you say, I support the Constitution. Shouldn't the governor, shouldn't the Secretary of State, shouldn't the Supreme Court of my state support the Constitution when they don't? I expect the state legislature, when it acts, to follow its own Constitution. I mean, I'm expected to follow my state's Constitution. And when they don't, apparently there is no remedy. None. This is how you get one-party rule in these states, and ultimately this is how you get one-party rule in the country. The Supreme Court of the United States may have just sealed its own fate. I don't know. We'll see what happens in Georgia. I pray to God we win at least one of those seats. But if we lose them both, and the court itself gave the glide path to a Biden presidency without actually taking up the substance of very, very serious lawsuits, well, then it would have cut its own throat. I'll be right back. You have widespread institutionalized corruption. You have violations of Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 of the United States Constitution. That case is before the court, and they let it die. You had another case before the court that said, wait a minute, the legislature violated its own Constitution. It can't violate its own Constitution when selecting electors for the federal offices of President and Vice President of the United States. The Supreme Court in one sentence said, we're rejecting your emergency appeal. Then Texas, with 18 states, and says, okay, Supreme Court, look, we got 4 states here that changed the rules at the last moment to help Biden and the Democrats. That violates the Equal Protection Clause for the other states and causes other issues that they raise. And the court says you don't have any standing because what goes on in the other states is basically none of Texas's business. That's where we are. And what all of this means, despite what all these so-called experts say and write, they're all getting behind their keyboards now, right? As I said here, and I quote myself, and I link to myself, and as I said here, what all of this means is the institutionalized corruption and fraud by these states, whether it's Republicans in the state legislature in Pennsylvania that violated their own Constitution, whether it's the Pennsylvania Supreme Court that not only violated the Constitution, but then went ahead and changed election laws to comport with what the Biden campaign wanted, whether it's Georgia, in which the signature requirement was changed because the Secretary of State there, a Republican, buckled and to Tracy and changed the signature requirements there, or whether it's these other states, the Supreme Court says there's no relief. There's nothing you can do about it. There's nothing you can do about it. Now, let me ask you a question. If these were Democrat lawsuits, and the Democrats controlled the United States Senate today, what would they be doing, Mr. Producer? They would be changing the Supreme Court, wouldn't they? They wouldn't tolerate this. They wouldn't put up with it. They wouldn't tolerate this. They wouldn't put up with it. You know, my first book was called Men in Black, How the Supreme Court is Destroying America. Many of you call the program or you comment on my various social sites and you say, take it to court, take it to court, take it to court. So let's say you take it to court and this happens. I don't need to hear any commentary from kids in their 20s who know nothing about the Supreme Court and know nothing about the law. I don't need to hear any commentary from never-Trumpers who are just filled with hate and contempt and utterly irrational. Utterly irrational. The Supreme Court gave this virtually no attention. Virtually no attention. The original Article 2 case about the legislatures acting within their lawful bounds, taking action, they gave it 18 words. The Article 2 violations, where you have a court and a governor and a Secretary of State who are changing the laws illegally, but changing the laws for elections within weeks of the election in Pennsylvania, and the Supreme Court, in the form of Alito, takes it up, issues a warning to the Secretary of State twice to segregate the ballots, and then we never hear from them again. We never hear from them again. So we have a breakdown of law and order and a breakdown of our constitutional order. And don't let these people who beat their chests and say the court did exactly the right thing sway you at all, because the court did not. And so where are we? I don't need to hear from professor this one and former federal prosecutor that one and all this, so forth and so on. We can figure this out ourselves. We can figure this out ourselves. This country's in very, very deep trouble. When one political party can institutionalize its fraud in order to try and make sure that its candidate wins, by hook or by crook, by violating Article 2 of the Constitution, by violating state law, by making changes at the last minute, all intended to lift election protections, all intended to enhance the Democrat Party and their candidate. I want to tell you a little secret. If a Republican president running for re-election and getting almost 75 million votes, 12 million than he received the first time around when he won, and millions more than any other candidate in the history of this country, if that Republican sitting president can't win because an individual that has minor support from the population, who barely campaigned, can get 80 million votes, we can never win the presidency. We can never win the presidency. You don't need law professors and former federal prosecutors to explain this to you. This is obvious. So while at the state level they can institutionalize fraud, they can eliminate barriers, it turns out that that's perfectly fine. Now, every time I talk about this, I come under attack from sleazeballs at the Washington Post or sleazeballs at the New York Times or sleazeballs elsewhere because I dare to even discuss this. But understand, these people are of a totalitarian and fascistic mindset. These people work for news outlets that didn't find the Holocaust newsworthy, or news outlets that were propagandists for Joseph Stalin in the 1930s. I can sleep at night. My conscience is clear. I have never been a mouthpiece for anything of that sort. Nothing. And so I thought I'd point this out. So here we are, late Friday afternoon, really a Friday evening, and the Supreme Court strikes. They wanted to get this off their table so they could enjoy their weekend. We can't have these cases hanging around. And I will tell you this. I don't ever want to talk to a Supreme Court justice again. I want nothing to do with any of them. Period. Period. Nothing. They know who they are. I want nothing to do with them. What the hell good use are they? And I'll be right back.
Mark Levin.